Happy New Year everyone, and welcome to my ranked list of all dungeons in Dragonflight Season 1, including the new 8 Dragonflight dungeons and 4 old dungeons added to Mythic Plus rotation of this season. I'm a veteran of World of Warcraft, but a rather casual tank who doesn't like to sweat too much and wants to enjoy the content rather than push through it with the clenched teeth. If you're playing the game similarly to me, or if you're just a beginner tank of WoW who simply wants to find an easier path for yourself, I suppose, then this video is absolutely for you. It is going to be a flat list of all 12 dungeons, meaning that I've lined up all of the dungeons, including Dragonflight ones and the ones in Mythic Plus rotation. Secondly, I will rank the dungeons and order them, starting with the least preferred one and finishing with the most preferred one, in my humble opinion, and yes, very subjectively. And finally, I always maintain a perspective of a casual player who seeks enjoyment and kinda the best ratio of reward versus time and effort investment. Some people rank dungeons based on the other criteria, but the ease of walkthrough and relative fun and enjoyment are my own. In other words, the best dungeon, in quotes, in this list is going to be the most appealing to a casual and beginner tank of WoW, in my humble opinion. Please keep that in mind. So with that out of the way, let's get started with the list. In the last 12th place is my least preferred dungeon, the Court of Stars, which is part of Mythic Plus rotation of Dragonflight Season 1. If you're watching this video far into the future, a few months from now, praise the Lord that this dungeon might be out of seasonal rotation by the time you watch this video. Why am I so harsh and why am I ranking it so low? Because of very complex pathing through the dungeon that you need to know as a tank, because of the most debilitating and horrible trash, because of convoluted boss mechanics, and the pre-final boss Find the Spy minigame, which I hate with absolute passion. Steer clear of this dungeon if you're a beginner tank of WoW and not a completionist. In the well-deserved 11th place, very close to the bottom of my list, one of the new Dragonflight dungeons is Brackenhide Hollow, which I hate as a tank because of too much trash and too many patrols up front before you even hit the first boss, slightly convoluted and lengthy pathing through the dungeon from the first to second boss, general sucky atmosphere, and plenty of runners who run at low health and bring more trash. Trash here makes you hate being a tank, and as WoW is a game and enjoyment is important, this dungeon sucks all around, in my humble opinion. In the 10th place are Halls of Infusion. Another new dungeon of Dragonflight. Halls of Infusion might seem not too bad at first, until you start dealing with harder difficulties of content, say Mythic Plus 2 and so on, where the annoying tankable poison stacking swoglets start giving you trouble, or the final stretch before the end boss begins, where those swirlies, the water swirlies, try and throw you off the path, and the boss itself, the final boss itself, doesn't forgive any mistake of standing in bad. Of course, this is subject to balancing, but at the moment of recording of this video, I personally rank this dungeon rather low. In the 9th place is Temple of the Jade Serpent. This used to be one of my favorite dungeons in Mists of Pandaria, but in case you don't know, they've changed it quite a bit in Mythic Plus of Dragonflight Season 1. And in my humble opinion, the dungeon is rather stressful and quite sucky now. In fact, it sucks for a tank, but I cannot even imagine how a healer must feel in this dungeon. It starts okayish, but sort of around the third boss, the Flameheart girl, and the trash all around her, you realize just how much they fear you and the whole group, and generally that whole home stretch kind of sucks so much more than it ever did. So maybe partly this low score of mine is due to them crushing my good and fond memories of Pandaria, I don't know. In the 8th place I've put Halls of Valor, which I think deserve better, but in Mythic Plus rotation of Season 1 and with the walkthrough of mine available on my channel right now, you will see that while the dungeon makes me feel quite nostalgic and is generally not the absolute worst, But I have to consider the newbies here, and it's rather long, and the trash, the wolves especially around Fenrir boss area, can be very, very lethal and quite annoying, which is why I haven't scored this dungeon any higher. I wish I could, personally. For new tanks, it's going to be quite fatiguing due to the length of the dungeon. It is not the easiest on pathing once again, and there are a lot of, in my opinion, harder line of sight based pulls. In the place number 7 is the Nokhud Offensive, a new Dragonflight dungeon that you need to fly around. Is rather straightforward in terms of pathing, but painful upon closer examination, especially in Mythic Plus mode. I've had 15 plus deaths completing it in Mythic Plus 4. And yes, partly it's because I suck, as surely the experts would tell me right now, and partly because the whole group wasn't super outgearing the content, as not many groups do these days. I find the patrols around the first boss and simply the trash with a large aggro radius around the third boss, the graveyard, very, very annoying. And also in Mythic Plus, gauging how much trash you need to pull to fill up the enemy forces bar is somehow turning to be a challenge in this dungeon, particularly because of the way of its rather loose pathing through. So you can fly anywhere you want, right? Rather than follow a specific path, and you know, as you follow a specific path, you kind of kill the necessary amount of trash. Here it's not really clear, which will surely throw beginner tanks off, which made this dungeon deserve its kind of lower ranking. Number 6 in my list is given to Shadowmoon Burial Grounds, an old dungeon making an appearance in Mythic Plus Season 1 rotation. This one is not too bad and rather straightforward, yes, but not scoring higher because of its slightly obscure pathing to the first boss, nothing too dramatic. Watch my guide in case you're lost. And mostly the worms leading up to the third boss are super annoying as they throw you into the water, which I absolutely hate. So this is just a personal dislike here talking. I didn't score this dungeon any higher because of that reason. In the spot number 5, I'm gonna surprise you here, are the Ruby Life Pools. I know you will be surprised, and let me explain why it's only a number 5. Because I'm considering Mythic Plus difficulty and experience rather than a normal or perhaps a heroic dungeon one. For normal and heroic, this would be a number 1, because the dungeon is short, very straightforward, it's in the first zone, you name it. It's a win for sure. But on Mythic and Mythic Plus, things get very dicey. I've seen it one too many times now, around the second boss area and her ads, where you go in a circle and need to first clear the whole area and then fight her. The number of those fire AoE ads, those little dragons that come down in Mythic Plus and not in the other difficulties, the more ads spawning everywhere. The fight itself with the boss, who leaves all these massive AoE on the ground, often splitting your group in half. It's just very unenjoyable for some reason. So just take it as a word of warning that while you are on lower difficulties, sure, go enjoy Ruby Life Pools and, let's say, Azure Vault as your first dungeons. But on Mythic Plus, especially kind of mid to higher keys, this is not the worst that you can see in my ranking, but definitely not the best either. Slightly better than Ruby Life Pools, but also not the top of my list, is number 4, Neltharus Dungeon. This is where things get harder to rank, because Neltharus is actually quite hard to pass through as a new tank at first, and there is a lot of fire AoE happening here too. But overall, the difficulty of normal, heroic, mythic and lower Mythic Plus keys here is just not increasing as abruptly and steeply and as in some other dungeons that we have access to. At least that's how I feel. Plus, you can skip a lot of trash in here if you watched my walkthrough video and trained yourself on an easy or normal difficulty, yeah? Which will absolutely make your life easier than in Mythic Plus and will make you a better tank. That's why this dungeon is scoring so high on my list relatively to others. In the place number 3 is Algethar Academy. Algethar Academy is somewhat similar to Neltharus in a way that the difficulties I usually play up to lower Mythic Plus keys seem to be progressing quite nicely here, without feeling like you're okay in Heroic, and then suddenly you get completely smashed in Mythic Plus 2. This counts for a lot actually from the perspective of a casual and a beginner tank, and I'm sure you would agree with me if you give it a go yourself. The dungeon is straightforward, relatively quick, and kind of enjoyable, I would even say, earning it its 3rd place in my ranking. In the place number 2 is the Azure Vault. Without a doubt the most straightforward dungeon, where it's like you don't need to think where to go, you just go forward, right? It is not too long. The Azure Vault is a number 2, only because in Mythic Plus the trash, especially around the Azure Blade, 2nd boss and forward, becomes quite annoying, which I guess can be said about most of those dungeons. The higher you go in the keys, the more annoying the trash becomes. And the 2nd and last bosses are quite painful if DPS doesn't know what to do. I've done a quick and early walkthrough through the Azure Vault to give my absolute beginner tanks a bit of an idea of how to go through the dungeon, but I haven't given it justice because I've only looked at it on normal, yes, and I will be doing it justice and releasing a separate video and a separate guide for Mythic Plus guides separately to explain some of the more painful mechanics of the Azure Vault, so stay tuned. In the place number 1 is Uldaman Legacy of Tyr. Even though Uldaman Legacy of Tyr is a bit out of the way to get to, and it's also a bit long as a dungeon, kind of similar to the Halls of Valor, you might say. Aside from those 2 points, it's a very good, very straightforward dungeon, absolutely deserving a number 1 spot in my humble opinion, as long as you're not in a hurry as a tank planning to run it. It's very straightforward in terms of where to go, bosses are kind of fun, relatively easy as long as your DPS doesn't completely suck, and the relative spread of rewards that you can get from this particular dungeon is actually quite good for a lot of tanking classes that I would play, and presumably you would play too, starting with very good trinkets and finishing with nice plate and leather and mail pieces of armor and a weapon even for my druid, for example. Plus, I personally like the atmosphere here, which is why it is deserving a place number 1 in my list. And there you go, my friends, my early 2023 ranked list of all Dragonflight dungeons that you can go tank right now if you so fancy. Of course, things are subjective and everything depends on your group. So you could totally have the best time in the Court of Stars with a good group and someone not minding to show you the way, or have the worst time in Uldaman. But we can't count on those random factors. If we do that, no list or ranking would stand any criticism whatsoever because your experience varies too much. I hope you've enjoyed this list and further insights into tanking of Dragonflight dungeons. If you did, please don't skip it and spare a moment and like the video right now and subscribe for more guides from me. It means a lot, tells me that I'm doing something right. Happy New Year, everyone. Talk to you next time.